I'm Rachel Davis, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the wall pieces that I've made for this exhibition. All the mosaics in this collection have all been inspired by nature. So nature has always been a theme in my work, so much so that ultimately it led to me writing a book about how to create mosaics inspired by nature. So some of the work in this exhibition is work that I made before I wrote the book. Some of the pieces are mosaics that I made specifically for the book, and then I've included a few works that I've made since I wrote the book that were specifically for this exhibition. So let's take a look at some of the mosaics in the exhibition, and I'll tell you a little bit about some of the stories behind them. This mosaic was inspired by tree rings, and what I liked when I started looking at images of tree rings and doing a bit of research was the way that tree rings could tell a story. And I've been looking for a while to find a way to create a mosaic to tell my story about having COVID and how it affected my energy levels, because for a long time after I had COVID I really struggled with my energy. And so this mosaic kind of represents kind of my journey through that. So I've used a mix of materials in this mosaic. I've got some really bright, vibrant oranges to represent the really sort of vibrant energy sections. And I've used more sort of natural materials, darker materials for the areas that represent kind of areas of fatigue or tiredness. And so the center is created sort of with orange. And then as you kind of move out through the rings, it kind of shows sort of a variation of more energy and then feeling tired and then sort of energy again. It's mainly circles, but I've also kind of particularly used sort of some bigger bits of slate and some bits on edge that kind of cut across the rings to kind of represent how even when something's going well or I've got a lot of energy, that if I overdo things, then the tiredness was still there. What I like about the materials in this mosaic is that there's kind of a whole different mix of kind of oranges in here. There's kind of more natural materials that are a little bit more muted. So things like I've got some sort of terracotta and some brick that are a little bit more, as I say, muted and natural. And then there's a really vibrant glass. I particularly like this glass that kind of comes around the outer ring here. This is specific glass that somebody made for me. It's a layered glass, which meant that I could kind of chip away at the surface of it and reveal different colours underneath. And I felt that really worked well in terms of representing the kind of different layers of energy and fatigue within that. So I've kind of interspersed that kind of around that outer ring here and used it in the middle as a kind of section right in the middle to sort of show the energy at the start. So this mosaic is a little bit different from the others in the exhibition in that it uses nature to help me tell a particular story, both through the design of it and the materials that have been used. So yeah, I'm really happy with the outcome and the overall look of it. This seaweed-inspired mosaic was one that I made specifically for my book, but the inspiration for it came from when I did a course in Northern Ireland, and I'd been down to the coast and I'd seen these beautiful colours of the seaweed. The tutors of the course encouraged me to kind of bring some seaweed back to the studio to kind of look at the colours more, look at the shapes, and it was through that process that I kind of decided to create something that kind of looks like the seaweed rather than the usual, a little bit more abstract work that I usually create. For the book, I also wanted to create a piece that was a little bit more ambitious, something that could demonstrate a number of different techniques. So the base that I mosaiced this piece onto, I created this kind of undulating substrate that gave it a little bit more dimension. I chose to use materials that reflected those colours that originally attracted me to the seaweed. So I chose to use colours that, were sort of reds and oranges, browns, these really lovely rich colours. And it's also a piece that I kind of experimented a bit with using a different colour of tile adhesive. Usually I use black, but this one I use this kind of quite a bright red adhesive, which again just enhances the colour of the materials. I found when I was creating this piece it was useful to divide my palette of materials into different colours. So I've kind of got yellows, I've got oranges, I've got reds, and within each of these rows there's lots of different materials, so that gives it lots of interest, lots of textures, and it also meant that if I just had like a little bit of one material I could still include it. The other thing that was a little bit different about this mosaic is that the background is then done in sand, which again was a little bit of an experiment, and I talk in the book about, sort of how I did some samples just to make sure that everything would work. But yeah, I kind of felt that the sandy background fitted with kind of the seaweed theme. It gives it a little bit more texture while not detracting from the mosaic itself. So yeah, it's just a little bit different, lots of different techniques to demonstrate all the different things that you can do with mosaic. So this mosaic was inspired by seaweed from an image that I'd taken of the seaweed just kind of flowing across the rocks. And I really liked the patterns and the textures in the image that I had and wanted to kind of translate that into mosaic. I'd done a smaller version of this for my 100 Days project and really liked the kind of the materials and the way they all sat together. And so I wanted to create this kind of larger version. So this piece was created on a handmade substrate. So I created a substrate that kind of undulated to kind of reflect the way the seaweed kind of undulated over the rocks. I mainly used two different kinds of slate in it. So I've kind of got a darker slate at the top and then this lovely slate that has all these rusty yellow colours nearer the bottom. And it was a really fun piece to make because I could just kind of use the bigger pieces to kind of create the flow, and then all the little gaps are sort of filled in with little bits of filarti or little bits of stone or ceramic tile, just to create that kind of flow of the seaweed going over the rocks. This Coastal Rocks piece is one of the first mosaics that I made directly inspired by a photograph that I'd taken. So I'd taken a photograph of these rocks by the coast. I really loved kind of the colours of the lichen and the seaweed all together and wanted to translate that into a mosaic. I've used kind of lots of big chunks of slate for kind of the rocks and filled all the gaps with all these little bits of yellow to represent the lichen and the colours that I saw there. What I really like about this piece though is kind of the seaweed section at the bottom, and basically for that I kind of raided my studio and picked out all the materials that were the right colour and then just kind of created a whole different mix of lines using this mix of materials. And what I really like about that technique is that it creates a really interesting kind of surface and texture in the mosaic. So this Star Trails mosaic is probably the largest mosaic in the exhibition, and it's one that's come about as a result of earlier work. It was actually during COVID that I first created a mosaic inspired by star trails as a response to seeing images that were created by photographers of star trails that were really clear because all the planes had been grounded. And so I created kind of a mosaic inspired by that. It was more of a spirally kind of one. And then I went on to create a second piece that was a little bit different from that. And then this larger work sort of followed on from those two. This one was actually made for another exhibition that took place in Chester Cathedral last year. The theme was of constellations, so that kind of fitted in with that exhibition. It's created with lots and lots of slates, slate laid on its edge, slate that's been cut with a tile saw to create some sort of lighter colours, and sort of just interspersed with lots of bits of glass, some really bright glass, some iridescent glass to give it a bit of sparkle, and yeah, just create this lovely kind of flow of materials that go around.